December 29, 1944. In the dense darkness over the Philippine Islands, Major Carroll C. Smith was settled into the confined cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow, rumbling down the runway at McGuire Field on Mindoro Island. His eyes scanned the black void ahead. In the compartment behind him, his radar operator was focused on a glowing green screen, tracking an unidentified blip moving at 180 knots. At just 26 years old, Smith was already a veteran of 43 combat missions with 4 confirmed enemy aircraft to his name. That night, Japanese command had dispatched a dozen bombers with a single, devastating objective: to cripple the American airfields being built on Mindoro. Smith knew their grim routine. For 2 straight weeks, the Japanese had relentlessly hammered Mindoro, triggering 334 air raid alerts in just 14 days. American engineers were working around the clock to construct 2 vital airstrips, crucial for the upcoming Lingayen Gulf invasion. The Japanese high command grasped the strategic significance of these airfields. If American fighters could operate from Mindoro, they could provide air cover for the entire invasion fleet. The Japanese were determined to halt construction. Night after night, they sent everything they had: conventional bombers, even Kamazes, any aircraft that could deliver a payload of explosives. Smith's 418th Night Fighter Squadron had only arrived on December 26th. His unit was the sole shield protecting the 20,000 American servicemen sleeping in tents below. The weight of responsibility was immense. Every bomber that penetrated their defenses meant dead engineers and construction crews, damaged airfields, a postponed invasion, and ultimately, more American lives lost at Lingayen Gulf. Smith's P-61 was a ghost, a predator the Japanese had never encountered. The Northrop Black Widow was the first American aircraft conceived from the ground up for nocturnal warfare. With a 66-foot wingspan and twin Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines, each generating 2,000 horsepower, it could reach a top speed of 366 miles per hour. But its true lethality lay not in its 4 20mm cannons housed in the belly. It was the SCR-720 radar housed in the nose. This system could detect other aircraft up to 5 miles away in total darkness. The Japanese had no inkling of its existence. They flew under the cover of night, convinced it made them invisible. They were tragically mistaken. The radar operator, seated behind the pilot in his own isolated station, monitored a luminous screen that painted a picture of the sky's secrets. Lieutenant Philip Porter, Smith's radar operator, had been interpreting these ghostly signals for 6 months. He was an expert at reading the scope, at guiding Smith toward unseen targets, and at distinguishing friendly aircraft from enemy bombers. The tactical equation was grim and straightforward: 1 P-61 against 12 Japanese bombers. If Smith engaged one target, the other 11 would be free to unleash their destruction on the airfields below. The numbers were unforgiving. Even if Smith managed to shoot down 3 or 4 bombers, the rest would still complete their mission. American casualties would climb, the airfields would be damaged, and the invasion timetable would be pushed back. Smith had spent 18 months training for this exact scenario at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida. Endless hours of radar intercept procedures, night navigation, and gunnery practice in pitch-black conditions. The training was so rigorous because night combat was the most perilous form of aerial warfare. There were no visual cues, no horizon to orient by, only instruments, radar returns, and the constant prayer that the target you were closing in on wasn't a friendly. The 418th had flown its first combat mission in November 1943 from crewed airstrips in New Guinea, initially flying P-70 Havocs, then modified P-38 Lightnings equipped with experimental radar sets. The P-61s arrived in September 1944, and they were a revelation. The Black Widow was everything the earlier night fighters were not: stable, forgiving, and immensely powerful. And its radar system actually worked reliably. But even the advanced technology of the P-61 couldn't solve Smith's immediate problem. 12 bombers were inbound. His fuel would last for approximately 3 hours. If he spent 10 minutes on each engagement, he could only intercept 3 bombers before being forced to return to base. That meant 9 bombers would get through. 9 bombers could mean hundreds of casualties, or even thousands if they struck the fuel or ammunition dumps. If you're fascinated by this incredible tale of aerial combat, please tap the like button. Your support helps us unearth and share more of these lost chapters from history. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. Back in the cockpit over Muro, at 2,342 hours, Porter's voice crackled through the intercom. He had 4 distinct contacts on his scope, all heading south toward the airfields, all at different altitudes. Smith had a critical decision to make. Which bomber to pursue first, and was his audacious plan to intercept all for a stroke of genius or a suicide mission? Smith advanced the throttles. The twin R-2800 engines roared to life, propelling the Black Widow upward at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out a stream of precise verbal corrections. Heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith could see nothing through the canopy but an endless, inky blackness. There was no moon, no stars, and a heavy cloud ceiling obscured everything. This was precisely why the Japanese had chosen tonight. They believed the absolute darkness rendered their bombers invisible to conventional fighters. But Smith was not flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar utilized a rotating parabolic dish in the aircraft's nose, sending out microwave pulses in a 180-degree arc. When these pulses struck an aircraft, they bounced back, appearing as a glowing blip on the operator's scope. The scope had 2 displays, one for azimuth, left or right of the nose, and one for elevation, above or below. Porter monitored both simultaneously, guiding Smith with verbal cues. This system was only as good as the man interpreting it, and Porter was exceptional. At a range of 3 miles, Smith activated his own, smaller radar scope integrated into his main instrument panel. Once the target was close enough, he could track it himself, allowing him to close for the kill without relying solely on Porter's instructions. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M, which the Americans had codenamed Betty. It was powered by 2 2,000-horsepower Mitsubishi engines, had a crew of 7, and could carry a 1,760-pound bomb load. But it had a fatal flaw. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single, well-placed burst from Smith's cannons would turn the bomber into a flying inferno. The range closed to 2 miles. Smith could now see the target on his own scope, a steady, unwavering blip. The bomber crew had no idea a predator was closing in on their tail. Japanese bombers were not equipped with tail-warning radar. They had no means of detecting a pursuing night fighter. They flew through the night under the false assumption of safety. The P-61 was designed to make that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards, still unable to see the Betty visually. The darkness was absolute. He relied completely on the radar scope, watching the blip grow larger as the distance shrank. 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, he finally saw it. A dark silhouette etched against the marginally lighter cloud cover. The faint orange glows from the engine exhausts were barely visible. Smith maneuvered the P-61 into position, slightly below and behind the bomber. The 4 20mm Hispano cannons were fixed forward, meaning Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight, which projected an illuminated reticle onto a glass plate. He adjusted his position until the bomber was perfectly centered in the reticle. At 400 yards, Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon carried 200 rounds, for a total of 800, enough for about 40 seconds of continuous fire. But Smith wouldn't need that long. Night fighter doctrine emphasized short, concentrated bursts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill, and move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on one bomber meant fewer rounds for the others. At 350 yards, Smith pressed the firing button. The 4 cannons roared in unison, a deafening sound even over the engine noise. A stream of 20mm high-explosive shells tore toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second, the tracers looking like red lines drawn across the night sky. Smith fired for 2 seconds, 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells in total. The Betty's starboard wing erupted in a fireball as its fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled to the right and plunged into a steep dive. Smith watched it fall, the burning aircraft illuminating the clouds below before it hit the water 8 miles north of Muro at 2,357 hours. One bomber down, 11 to go. But Smith's fuel gauge already showed he had burned through 15% of his fuel. And Porter's scope still showed 3 more contacts, all heading for the airfields, all separated by miles of black sky. Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Porter identified the second target at 0014 hours on December 30th. Heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and began to descend. The problem was one of geometry. The second bomber was 23 miles from the location of the first kill. The P-61's cruising speed was 280 miles per hour, meaning it would take roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes during which the bomber would be flying closer to Mindoro, closer to its target. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster, to 320 miles per hour. At these high power settings, the R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate. Every minute at maximum speed cost him precious fuel, but if he didn't intercept the bomber quickly, it would reach the target zone where American anti-aircraft fire would be his only chance to stop it. The mathematics of night interception were brutal. Most missions ended without making contact. The sky was vast, and even with radar, finding a single bomber required flawless coordination between pilot and radar operator. Finding 4 bombers in a single night was almost unheard of. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills total in 14 months in the Pacific. Smith already had 4. Adding 4 more in one night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the war. But records were the last thing on his mind. The only thing that mattered was stopping those bombers. Porter called out corrections as Smith adjusted his heading. The second contact grew stronger on the radar scope. 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile. Another Betty. Same profile, same vulnerable fuel tanks. This one was flying lower at 6,000 feet, closer to the cloud layer, which gave Smith less room to maneuver. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be flawless. Too fast and he'd overshoot. Too slow and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters thrived on surprise. Once the enemy knew you were there, everything changed. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly, a dark shape against a dark sky. The bomber crew was flying straight and level, no evasive maneuvers, no indication they were aware of the Black Widow. The P-61's matte black paint made it nearly invisible at night, and its engines were quieter than most fighters. The Japanese had dubbed the P-61 the Black Widow and learned to fear it, but fear was only useful if you knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range, 350 yards. He fired. Another 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The shells ripped through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire, followed immediately by the left. Within seconds, both wings were engulfed in flames. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it hit the water at 0019 hours. 17 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers down, 10 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge now read 42%. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope, both closer to Mindoro than the previous targets at different altitudes, one at 9,000 feet, the other at 4,000 feet and 8 miles apart. Smith made a decision. He would go for the higher target first. Climbing burned less fuel than a rapid descent, but the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get even closer to the airfields. If he made the wrong choice, one bomber would get through, and the entire mission would be a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 0023. Porter locked onto the third contact. Range 7 miles, heading 160, speed 190 knots. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Bettys, and it was taking evasive action, turning, changing altitude. Someone on that aircraft knew the Americans had night fighters in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu, which the Americans called Helen. It was faster than the Betty, with a maximum speed of 306 miles per hour and better defensive armament, including a 20mm cannon. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Approaching from dead astern would put Smith squarely in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind, he came from below and to the left, the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith intended to exploit that weakness. The range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, then descending 300. The pilot was experienced, understanding that predictable flight made him an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Porter compensated by anticipating the bomber's movements, watching the pattern, and predicting the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot made a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration gave it excellent stability, and the aircraft responded smoothly to his control inputs, keeping the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range, 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streaked past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had only seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive maneuvers. He squeezed the trigger, holding it down for a 3-second burst, 72 rounds. A longer burst was necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000, before hitting the water at 0029 hours. 29 minutes after midnight. 3 bombers down, 9 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge now showed just 28%. This was a critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 30% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing or worse. Running out of fuel over the open ocean at night was a death sentence. There would be no visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would strike the water before the pilot even realized he was too low. Porter had one more contact on his scope. The fourth target, heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfields sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready, their gunners waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the fourth bomber. Diving would conserve fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him a better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above, using gravity to increase his speed and reduce the target's reaction time. The range closed. 4 miles, 3, 2. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another Betty. It was flying straight toward Mindoro, no evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area or didn't care, perhaps believing his mission was more important than his own survival. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill, below and behind at 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds remaining, enough for 3 more attacks. But this was the fourth target. He needed to make every shot count. His fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. One chance, one burst, then he had to return to base. Smith fired at 0034 hours. A 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The bomber's port wing sheared off from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured, and fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean, impacting at 0035 hours, 35 minutes after midnight, for bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The calculation was simple. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed roughly 100 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons left, enough for another 36 minutes of flight. More than enough to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they had detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. For kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact. But Smith's night wasn't over. At 0042, Porter detected a new contact, heading north. Range, 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field. Fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfields he had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much. He might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse, letting a Japanese bomber reach Muro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th got through and killed Americans on the ground, the entire night's work would be tarnished. Numbers didn't matter if someone died because Smith had prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called out vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles. 2, 1. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hay-8, which the Americans called Frank. A single-engine fighter with a top speed of 392 miles per hour and armed with 4 12.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. It was one of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, and had a better rate of climb. In daylight, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in the complete darkness. Smith had one advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know he was there. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range, 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller, harder targets, and the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach McGuire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost for future intercepts. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight, his finger resting on the trigger. The choice was clear, if not easy. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15%, below the minimum safety margin. But letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at 0045 hours. He squeezed the trigger, holding it for a 3-second burst, 72 rounds, the longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames, and thick black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute open, a white canopy against the black sky. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 0046 hours. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 15%. The engagement had consumed more fuel than he'd calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. At cruise power, he had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, just enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. Any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before he could land. Porter guided Smith toward Muro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large land mass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days, with minimal lighting and no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in the darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held a total of 646 gallons. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power, that provided 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, that meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Just enough fuel. Barely. At 0052, Smith spotted the runway lights. 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet of crushed coral. It was adequate for P-61 operations but lacked the safety features of established airfields. At 0055, something went wrong. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps were extinguished simultaneously, plunging the approach into absolute darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway at 800 feet, with an airspeed of 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter, which measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning. When the altimeter showed 0 feet, he would be on the ground. The technique was treacherous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway, into trees, coral reefs, or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time. Not enough to divert to another airfield. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights, or crash into the ocean. He turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was located. His altitude was 600 feet, fuel at 9%. The darkness below was absolute. He descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. He reduced airspeed to 120 knots, just 25 knots above the P-61's stall speed with full flaps. It wasn't much of a margin, but descending slower would burn more fuel. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly. Smith used his compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north, his heading 180 degrees. At 0058, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green lights confirmed the wheels were down and locked. He couldn't see the ground, only instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. At 100 feet, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. 75 feet, 50, 25. Smith prepared for touchdown, his hands gripping the control column. The P-61's main wheels hit the crushed coral at 0059 hours. The impact was harder than normal, but the landing gear held. The nose will touch down 3 seconds later. Smith applied the brakes, and the P-61 decelerated rapidly. He couldn't see where he was on the runway, so he kept the brakes applied until the aircraft stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. A ground crew arrived with flashlights and guided him to the parking area. The P-61's engines shut down at 0103, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out of the cockpit, his legs stiff and his hands shaking from exhaustion. Not fear. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. For bombers, 1 fighter, all exactly where Smith reported. The 4 kills in one night equaled the record for American night fighters. But Smith wasn't finished. Later that day, he flew a second mission. At 1,512 hours, Porter detected another contact. It was another Nakajima Ki 84 Frank. Smith, with altitude advantage, dove on the fighter from above, his speed increasing to 390 miles per hour. He fired at 400 yards. The Frank's engine exploded. It was Smith's 7th kill, making him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. McGuire Field supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from Mindoro provided air cover, made possible by the airfield Smith had defended. Smith survived the war, returned to the United States, and became a civilian, never seeking publicity. The P-61 Black Widow proved its worth, dominating night combat until it was replaced by jet-powered fighters after the war. But on that December night in 1944, over Mindoro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the best pilot flying it. If you were captivated by this incredible tale of skill and courage under impossible pressure, do us a favor and tap that like button. Every single like is a vote for more history like this. Hit subscribe and join our crew of history enthusiasts. We're bringing these forgotten stories to light every single day. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the States, the UK, Canada, Australia? Our community is global. Let us know you're here. Thank you for watching.